It was a bright Sunday morning in Memphis, Tennessee, and the New Hope Baptist Church stood as a beacon of serenity in the heart of the community. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the pews and illuminating the faces of the congregation. The church was filled to capacity, and the atmosphere was vibrant with hope and faith. Pastor Derek Hunter, an esteemed African-American leader in the community, delivered his sermon with passion, his deep voice resonating through the sanctuary. His reputation as a moral and spiritual guide had drawn people from all walks of life to his church, and today was no exception. Families, elders, and youth alike sat enraptured, their eyes fixed on the man who had become a pillar of strength and guidance for so many. The choir stood to the side of the altar, their harmonious voices blending seamlessly with the solemn notes of the organ. Every word Pastor Derek spoke seemed to lift the spirits of those listening. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective faith that seemed unshakable. Mothers clutched their children, couples exchanged knowing glances of comfort, and elders nodded in agreement to the pastor's words. It was a moment of unity, a moment of peace. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the sanctuary burst open, the loud sound of their impact cutting through the pastor's words like a jagged knife. Heads turned, the collective gasp of the congregation echoing through the church. Standing in the doorway was a young man, his figure outlined against the bright sunlight pouring in from outside. His disheveled appearance was impossible to ignore, his clothes were wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and in his shaking hands, he clutched a gun. It was Marcus James, a 19-year-old from the very community this church served. His face was a mixture of anguish and fury, his eyes wild with a pain that no one in the room fully understood at that moment. The church fell into a stunned silence, the once comforting sanctuary now gripped by an almost unbearable tension. Marcus took a step forward, his movements erratic, and the sound of his heavy boots against the polished wooden floor echoed ominously. His chest heaved as if he had run a great distance, though it was clear the weight he carried was not physical but emotional. Every gaze in the room was fixed on him, frozen in collective disbelief. As Marcus advanced down the aisle, his voice filled the room, trembling but loud enough to reverberate against the high ceilings. His accusations cut through the sacred air like shards of glass. He spoke with a mixture of anger and despair, each word laced with raw emotion. The congregation sat motionless, their breaths held, as the reality of the situation unfolded before their eyes. Pastor Derek stood at the altar, his previously commanding presence now reduced to a quiet stillness. His eyes widened as he recognized Marcus, his expression shifting from shock to something deeper, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, or a mixture of both. Marcus's steps quickened as he neared the front of the sanctuary, his grip on the weapon tightening. The scene seemed to stretch in time, each second heavier than the last. Children clung to their parents, some members of the congregation instinctively ducked behind the pews, and the choir froze in place, their voices silenced by the chaos. Derek raised a hand, as if to calm Marcus, but the gesture was too late. Marcus lifted the gun, and in the blink of an eye, the deafening sound of gunfire shattered the air. The first shot rang out, its sharp crack reverberating off the walls. Derek staggered, clutching his chest as a crimson stain spread across his shirt. The second shot followed almost immediately, striking him again and sending him collapsing onto the steps of the altar. Screams erupted from the congregation as panic broke out. People scrambled to the exits, their shouts and cries blending into a cacophony of chaos. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and worship, was now a scene of pandemonium. Marcus stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from its barrel. His chest heaved as he stared at Derek's fallen figure, the weight of what he had done slowly sinking in. His anger dissolved almost instantly, replaced by overwhelming guilt and despair. The gun slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the floor. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees in the center aisle. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands, his body racked with sobs that echoed in the now half-empty sanctuary. Derek lay on the floor near the altar, blood pooling beneath him as his wife, Anissa, rushed to his side. Her hands trembled as she pressed against his wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Her cries of anguish filled the room, a raw and unfiltered expression of heartbreak and fear. Around her, a few remaining members of the congregation stood paralyzed, unsure of what to do, their faith shaken by the violence that had unfolded before their eyes. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement and paramedics. Within moments, police officers entered the church, their weapons drawn, scanning the room for danger. Marcus did not resist as they approached him. He sat motionless, his tear-streaked face vacant, as they handcuffed him and led him away. Paramedics rushed to Derek, quickly assessing his injuries before lifting him onto a stretcher. Blood stained the once pristine white cloth that covered the altar, a grim reminder of the violence that had shattered the morning. As the ambulance sped away with Derek inside, and Marcus was taken into custody, the church fell into an eerie silence. The pews were empty, the stained glass windows cast distorted patterns of light on the bloodied floor, and the air was heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The remaining members of the congregation stood outside in small clusters, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. The sacred space that had once united them in faith now stood as a crime scene, forever changed by the events of that morning. Derek Hunter was born and raised in South Memphis, Tennessee, a part of the city known for its economic struggles and high crime rates. His early years were defined by hardship and resilience. The youngest of three siblings, Derek grew up in a small, aging house where his mother worked tirelessly as a nurse's aide to keep food on the table. His father, once a factory worker, had passed away suddenly when Derek was only 10 years old. The loss hit the family hard, but none harder than Derek. He was just beginning to understand the weight of responsibility and now faced the harsh realities of life without a father figure. In the years following his father's death, Derek struggled. He became withdrawn and angry, spending more time on the streets than in school. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had fallen in with a group of boys who spent their days roaming the neighborhood and their nights engaging in petty crimes. Derek's charm and natural charisma made him a leader among them, but deep down, he carried a sense of shame for the path he was on. His mother, deeply rooted in her faith, prayed for him daily, begging God to guide her son back to the light. It was her unwavering belief and quiet strength that began to shift something in Derek. She would often sit at the kitchen table after her long shifts, reading her Bible aloud as Derek pretended not to listen from the living room. Her voice, steady and full of conviction, began to stir something deep within him. The turning point came one night when a robbery gone wrong left one of Derek's closest friends wounded. The fear and guilt he felt that night were enough to make him reevaluate his life. At his mother's urging, Derek began attending church again, reluctantly at first. The community at New Hope Baptist Church welcomed him with open arms, and he found solace in the rhythm of the sermons and the hymns. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, something larger than himself to believe in. The church became his sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of his past mistakes. He threw himself into the teachings of the Bible, finding hope and direction in its verses. Slowly, he became an active member of the congregation, participating in youth programs and helping with community outreach. By the time he was 25, Derek had found his calling. He completed his theological studies and was ordained as a pastor. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The same charisma that had once led him astray now became a tool for good, drawing people to him and inspiring them to change their lives. Derek's sermons were powerful and relatable, infused with his own experiences and struggles. He built a reputation as a man of integrity, someone who understood the challenges of the community because he had lived through them himself. At 30, he founded New Hope Baptist Church, starting with a modest congregation that met in a rented community center. Over the years, the church grew, and Derek's reputation as a spiritual leader solidified. Despite his public image as a devoted husband to his wife, Anissa, and a compassionate leader, Derek carried a secret that threatened to unravel everything he had built. It began innocently enough during one of the youth programs at the church. Derek had always had a soft spot for the young men in the community who reminded him of himself at their age, angry, aimless, and in need of guidance. When he met Marcus James, a shy 19-year-old from a troubled background, Derek saw an opportunity to make a difference. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood not far from where Derek had spent his own childhood. His mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and his father had been absent for most of his life. Marcus was quiet, reserved, and seemed reluctant to open up to anyone. Derek took him under his wing, offering mentorship and a listening ear. At first, their relationship was entirely above reproach. Derek saw it as his duty to provide guidance to Marcus, just as others had done for him when he needed it most. But as time went on, their interactions became more frequent and personal. Derek began to confide in Marcus about his own struggles and insecurities, and Marcus, in turn, found himself drawn to Derek's warmth and attention. The boundary between mentor and mentee blurred, and what began as an innocent connection slowly transformed into something neither of them could fully control. Derek was acutely aware of the line he was crossing, but he convinced himself that his intentions were pure. He rationalized his actions, telling himself that he was simply helping Marcus, that the emotional closeness was a natural extension of their bond. But deep down, he knew the truth. The relationship had become inappropriate, a betrayal not only of his role as a pastor but also of the trust his congregation and his wife had placed in him. Determined to keep his secret, Derek became increasingly guarded. He took great care to ensure that his interactions with Marcus remained hidden, meeting him in private and avoiding any situations that might raise suspicion. The weight of the deception grew heavier with each passing day, but Derek convinced himself that he could manage it. He believed he could compartmentalize his life, keeping his role as a pastor and his forbidden relationship with Marcus separate. Unbeknownst to Derek, Marcus had begun to struggle with the secrecy of their relationship. What Derek saw as a necessary measure to protect his reputation, Marcus interpreted as rejection and shame. The cracks in their dynamic began to show, but Derek, blinded by his own guilt and fear of exposure, failed to see the storm brewing on the horizon. Derek Hunter's life had become a carefully constructed performance, one that required constant vigilance and meticulous control. To his congregation, he was the epitome of a righteous man, a devoted husband to Anissa, a loving father, and an unwavering spiritual leader. Every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit of New Hope Baptist Church, delivering sermons that moved people to tears and inspired hope in their hearts. His charisma and compassion made him the backbone of the community, a man who seemed above reproach. At home, he maintained the image of a dutiful husband, sharing quiet dinners with Anissa and participating in family routines. He played the role so well that even those closest to him had no reason to suspect the secrets he was hiding. Behind closed doors, Derek's life was far from the pristine image he projected. His relationship with Marcus James had grown into something he could no longer dismiss as a mere lapse in judgment. What had begun as mentorship had spiraled into a complex and dangerous entanglement. Marcus, with his youthful intensity and unrelenting need for connection, became a central figure in Derek's private world. They met in discreet locations, always careful to avoid any situation that might arouse suspicion. Derek assured himself that he had everything under control, that his secret life could coexist alongside his public persona without either unraveling. At first, Marcus seemed content with the arrangement. He was grateful for Derek's attention, for the way the older man made him feel seen and valued. But as weeks turned into months, Marcus began to want more. He grew tired of the secrecy, of the constant hiding and half-truths. The moments they shared, however passionate or meaningful, were always shrouded in guilt and fear. Marcus wanted Derek to acknowledge their relationship openly, to stop treating him as something that needed to be concealed. For Marcus, the secrecy felt like rejection, a denial of his worth, and it began to eat away at him. Derek, however, was paralyzed by fear. He knew the consequences of his actions and what would happen if his double life were exposed. The congregation that revered him would turn against him. Anissa, the woman who had stood by his side through years of triumphs and trials, would feel the full weight of his betrayal. Everything he had built, his church, his family, his reputation, would come crashing down. And so, he tried to maintain the precarious balance, placating Marcus with promises and gifts while doubling down on his commitments to the church and his family. The strain of living two lives began to take its toll on Derek. He became more irritable at home, more distant with Anissa. She noticed his late nights, his distracted demeanor, but when she asked if something was wrong, he always had an explanation ready. At church, Derek continued to perform, but the cracks in his facade were starting to show. His once fiery sermons began to lose their edge, and members of the congregation occasionally remarked on how tired he looked. Derek dismissed their concerns with a reassuring smile, but inside, he felt the weight of his deception growing heavier by the day. For Marcus, the situation became unbearable. He had invested so much of himself in the relationship, believing that Derek's love for him would eventually outweigh the fear of exposure. But as Derek grew more cautious, pulling away to protect his public image, Marcus felt increasingly abandoned. The promises Derek made began to feel hollow, and the sporadic meetings were no longer enough to satisfy the deep emotional connection Marcus craved. Resentment started to build, fueled by a sense of betrayal and rejection. The tension between them reached a breaking point during one of their secret meetings. Marcus, tired of being sidelined, demanded answers. He wanted Derek to choose, to either commit fully to their relationship or end it altogether. Derek, caught off guard and desperate to keep Marcus quiet, tried to placate him with vague reassurances and financial support. He promised that things would get better, that he just needed more time to figure everything out. But Marcus had heard it all before. This time, he wasn't willing to be appeased. Feeling cornered, Marcus issued an ultimatum. He threatened to reveal their relationship to Anissa and the congregation, knowing full well what such a revelation would mean for Derek. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Derek, terrified of the fallout, begged for more time. He promised to increase the financial support he was already providing and assured Marcus that he would find a solution. But the damage had been done. Marcus saw Derek's desperation as proof that he would never truly prioritize their relationship, that he would always choose his reputation and his position over him. In the days that followed, Marcus wrestled with his emotions. His love for Derek was still there, but it was now overshadowed by anger and a sense of betrayal. He replayed their conversations in his mind, each broken promise fueling his resolve. The secrecy, the lies, the constant feeling of being hidden and unworthy, it all became too much. Marcus decided that he could no longer stay silent. He began to plan his next move, determined to confront Derek in a way that would force him to acknowledge the truth, no matter the consequences. As Marcus's anger simmered, Derek's anxiety grew. He could sense that Marcus was reaching a breaking point, but he didn't know how to stop it. Every interaction with Marcus felt like walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. At the same time, he struggled to maintain the illusion of normalcy in his public life, knowing that the foundation of his carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Derek clung to the hope that he could somehow keep his secret buried, but deep down, he knew the storm was coming. And when it arrived, there would be no hiding from the truth. Derek Hunter awoke in a sterile hospital room, the fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on the white walls. His body ached, a deep, throbbing pain emanating from the wounds in his chest and abdomen. The steady beeping of monitors was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic reminder of his fragile state. As his eyes adjusted, the gravity of his situation began to settle in. He was alive, but the life he had so carefully constructed was on the verge of collapse. The truth he had worked so hard to bury was now exposed, and there would be no going back. News of the shooting had spread rapidly across Memphis. The name of Pastor Derek Hunter, once synonymous with faith and leadership, was now being uttered in hushed tones filled with shock and disbelief. Outside the hospital, reporters gathered in droves, their cameras and microphones aimed at anyone who might offer a comment. The shooting at New Hope Baptist Church was no longer just a tragedy, it was a scandal. Derek knew that the story would not fade quietly into the background. Questions would be asked, and answers would be demanded. Meanwhile, Marcus James sat alone in a small, dimly lit cell at the local detention center. The events of the church service replayed in his mind like a relentless nightmare. His hand still trembled as he thought about the gun, the screams, and the look on Derek's face as he collapsed. Guilt consumed him, overwhelming every other emotion. He had acted out of anger and betrayal, but now, sitting in the suffocating silence of the cell, he felt only regret. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, and the reality of his actions began to sink in. He had shattered not only Derek's life, but his own as well. At the hospital, Anissa Hunter sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly together. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. She had not left the building since Derek was brought in, her mind racing with unanswered questions. The chaos of the shooting had been traumatic enough, but it was the revelations that followed that truly broke her. Through whispers and fragmented accounts from members of the congregation, she had pieced together the shocking truth: her husband, the man she had built her life with, had been living a double life. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought possible. Anissa felt like a stranger to her own marriage, her trust and faith shattered in an instant. As Derek recovered in the hospital, the outside world erupted with speculation and judgment. The media seized the story, broadcasting every detail they could uncover. Headlines painted a picture of a fallen pastor, a respected man of God exposed as a fraud. Interviews with members of the congregation revealed a community in turmoil. Some expressed disbelief, clinging to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding. Others voiced anger and betrayal, struggling to reconcile the man they admired with the man the scandal had revealed. The church itself became the focal point of the community's pain and confusion. New Hope Baptist Church, once a sanctuary for so many, was now a symbol of broken trust. The church elders convened emergency meetings to address the crisis, but their efforts were complicated by new revelations. As they dug deeper into Derek's financial records, they uncovered discrepancies that pointed to years of mismanagement and potential fraud. Donations intended for the church's outreach programs had been funneled into private accounts. Expenses for lavish trips and unexplained withdrawals painted a damning picture. The scandal extended far beyond Derek's personal life, threatening the very foundation of the church he had built. Within the church, factions began to form. Some members rallied around Derek, refusing to believe the accusations and attributing his actions to human imperfection. Others called for his immediate removal, arguing that he had betrayed not only his family but the entire congregation. The elders faced mounting pressure to take decisive action, but the weight of the revelations left them paralyzed, unsure of how to proceed. Anissa, meanwhile, wrestled with her own internal conflict. The man she had loved and supported was not the man she thought she knew. She felt humiliated, betrayed, and angry, but she also felt a lingering sense of duty. She had vowed to stand by Derek in sickness and in health, for better or worse, and now she was faced with the ultimate test of that promise. She alternated between moments of steely resolve and overwhelming despair, unsure of what her next step should be. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the shooting continued to grow. The church's attendance plummeted as members distanced themselves from the scandal. Derek's name became a topic of gossip and condemnation in the community. Anissa avoided the media and the prying questions of neighbors, finding solace only in moments of solitude. She knew she had to make a decision, but the weight of it threatened to crush her. Should she support Derek as he faced the consequences of his actions, or should she leave him and begin to rebuild her life on her own terms? The choice loomed over her like a dark cloud, a reminder that the life she once knew was gone forever. Derek Hunter stood before the congregation of New Hope Baptist Church, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own guilt. The sanctuary was no longer the vibrant place it had once been. The pews, once filled with devoted members, were sparsely occupied. The faces that looked back at him were not ones of admiration but of disappointment, confusion, and anger. The room was silent, heavy with the anticipation of what he was about to say. Derek's voice, usually commanding and full of conviction, trembled as he began to speak. He confessed to everything: the affair, the lies, the misuse of church funds. He spared no detail, laying bare the truth that he had hidden for so long. As the words poured out, Derek felt the crushing weight of his actions. His reputation as a pastor and a moral leader was gone. The man he had presented to the world was now exposed as a fraud. He acknowledged the pain he had caused to his wife, Anissa, to Marcus James, and to the entire congregation that had trusted him. His confession was not met with forgiveness or understanding. It was met with silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. The congregation, torn between their faith and their anger, remained stoic, their eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed them. Meanwhile, Marcus James sat in a courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was dressed in a plain suit, his demeanor subdued and remorseful. The events of the shooting weighed heavily on him, and as the judge called his name, he stood to face the consequences of his actions. Marcus admitted to the crime, explaining how anger and heartbreak had driven him to the brink. His voice was steady but filled with regret as he recounted the moments leading up to the shooting. He apologized to Derek, to Anissa, and to the congregation. His words, though sincere, could not undo the damage, but they marked the beginning of his journey toward atonement. The court acknowledged Marcus's emotional state and the mitigating circumstances surrounding his actions. He was sentenced to probation and ordered to attend mandatory therapy sessions. The judge emphasized the importance of addressing the underlying issues that had led Marcus to that moment of violence. It was a second chance, one that Marcus did not take lightly. He left the courtroom knowing that his path forward would not be easy, but it would be one of redemption. Anissa Hunter, watching from the back of the church during Derek's confession, felt a wave of emotions that she could hardly process. The man she had once loved and trusted was now a stranger. She had stood by him through the initial shock of the shooting, but his public confession forced her to confront the full scope of his betrayal. As Derek stepped down from the pulpit, his head bowed, she knew that the life they had built together was beyond repair. That night, she packed her belongings and left the home they had shared, determined to find a new path for herself. In the weeks that followed, Anissa began to forge a new identity. The congregation, disillusioned and leaderless, looked to her for guidance. She had always been a quiet presence in the church, supporting Derek from the sidelines, but now she stepped into the spotlight. With a calm determination, she began the arduous task of rebuilding the community's trust. She organized meetings with church elders, spearheaded outreach programs, and worked tirelessly to ensure that New Hope Baptist Church could rise from the ashes of scandal. Her leadership was not without challenges. There were whispers of doubt and resentment, but her resilience inspired many to stay and support the church's renewal. Derek, now stripped of his role as pastor, found himself at a crossroads. The city of Memphis, once his home and his sanctuary, had become a place of pain and shame. The congregation had voted to remove him from his position, and the church's elders had filed formal complaints regarding his financial misdeeds. Facing the possibility of legal consequences and unable to bear the sight of the damage he had caused, Derek made the decision to leave. He packed his belongings into a modest suitcase and quietly departed the city. In the quiet of his solitude, Derek began a journey of self-reflection. He moved to a small town in another state, far from the spotlight of Memphis. He took on simple, humble work and began attending therapy sessions to confront the choices he had made and the harm he had caused. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. It was a painful process, but it was also necessary. Derek knew that redemption would not come from words or grand gestures, but from a sincere commitment to change. Back in Memphis, Marcus began his own path to healing. Therapy sessions helped him unpack the anger and pain that had driven him to such a destructive act. Slowly, he began to understand the complexities of his emotions and learned healthier ways to cope. He also sought to make amends in any way he could, volunteering at local organizations that supported at-risk youth. His experiences gave him a unique perspective, and he used his story as a cautionary tale to help others avoid the same mistakes. Anissa continued to lead the church with grace and determination. Under her guidance, the congregation began to heal, though the scars of Derek's actions remained. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the church's resources were used transparently, restoring faith in the institution. Over time, New Hope Baptist Church became a symbol of resilience and renewal, a testament to the power of community and forgiveness. For Derek, the road to redemption was long and winding. He remained distant from Memphis, aware that his presence would only reopen old wounds. But he stayed in touch with Anissa, offering her his support from afar. Their relationship, once defined by love and trust, had been irrevocably altered, but there was a quiet understanding between them. Derek knew that he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he was committed to living the rest of his life with humility and integrity. As the months turned into years, the story of Derek, Marcus, and Anissa became one of transformation rather than tragedy. Each of them, in their own way, found a path forward, shaped by the choices they had made and the lessons they had learned. It was not a perfect ending, but it was a real one, marked by growth, healing, and the possibility of a better future. Several years had passed since the fateful events at New Hope Baptist Church, and the institution had undergone a profound transformation. Under Anissa Hunter's leadership, the church was no longer simply a place of worship but had evolved into New Hope Community Center, a beacon of support and guidance for the local community in Memphis. What had once been a congregation shaken to its core by scandal was now a thriving hub for youth outreach programs, victim advocacy, and community empowerment. Anissa's vision had taken root, and the center had become a symbol of resilience and renewal. Anissa's days were long but fulfilling. She spent her mornings meeting with community leaders and planning new initiatives, her afternoons counseling victims of domestic violence, and her evenings overseeing youth mentorship programs. The community center offered everything from educational workshops to safe spaces for those in crisis. Anissa had poured her heart into building an institution that embodied the values the church had once claimed but failed to uphold: compassion, integrity, and service to others. Her quiet strength and unwavering dedication had earned her respect far beyond the congregation. People from all walks of life looked to her as a leader and a source of inspiration. Marcus James had also found a new purpose. After completing his education, he began working with at-risk youth in the same neighborhoods where he had once struggled. His experience gave him a unique ability to connect with the young men and women he mentored. He spoke candidly about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned, using his story as a tool to guide others away from the paths of anger and violence. Marcus had become a living example of redemption, his life now dedicated to preventing others from making the same choices he once had. His work was challenging, but it was also deeply rewarding, and he found healing in helping others heal. The New Hope Community Center was thriving, but the scars of the past still lingered in subtle ways. Some members of the old congregation had never returned, unable to reconcile the church's history with its new mission. Others had embraced the changes wholeheartedly, finding in the center a sense of purpose and belonging they had never experienced before. Slowly but surely, the community had begun to rebuild its trust in the institution, and the work being done at New Hope was changing lives. One Sunday morning, during a community service that brought together people from all over the city, an unfamiliar yet familiar figure appeared at the entrance of the sanctuary. Derek Hunter stood quietly at the door, his once imposing frame now slightly hunched with the weight of years of regret and introspection. His face was lined, his hair graying at the temples, but there was a humility in his presence that hadn't been there before. He hadn't set foot in Memphis since he had left, but something had drawn him back to the place where his life had unraveled and where, in many ways, it had also begun. The room fell silent as Derek walked slowly down the aisle. The congregation, many of whom had not seen him since the scandal, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He stopped at the front of the room, his gaze meeting Anissa's. She stood at the pulpit, her expression calm but unreadable. Marcus, seated in the front row, looked up, his face betraying the flicker of surprise. Derek's presence was unexpected, but neither Anissa nor Marcus moved to stop him as he turned to face the congregation. Derek began to speak, his voice steady but subdued. He told his story, not to justify his actions, but to share the hard lessons he had learned. He spoke of his fall from grace, the pain he had caused, and the long journey of self-reflection and repentance he had undertaken. He acknowledged the people he had hurt, from his wife to Marcus to the congregation itself. Derek's words were not polished or rehearsed, they were raw and honest, carrying the weight of a man who had spent years grappling with the consequences of his choices. The congregation listened in silence. Some faces were stern, others contemplative. It was clear that not everyone was ready to forgive, and Derek did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, he offered his story as a testament to the power of accountability and the possibility of change. He spoke of the work he had done since leaving Memphis, mentoring others who had lost their way and striving to live a life of humility and service. By the time he finished, the room was heavy with emotion, a mixture of pain, understanding, and tentative hope. After a moment of silence, Anissa stepped forward. She thanked Derek for sharing his story, acknowledging the courage it took to face the people he had wronged. Her words were measured and calm, a reflection of the strength she had cultivated over the years. Marcus stood as well, nodding briefly toward Derek before speaking to the congregation about the importance of redemption and the strength it takes to rebuild after a fall. Together, their presence framed the day not as a reopening of old wounds, but as a step toward collective healing. As the service concluded, Derek quietly left the sanctuary. He did not linger, knowing that his presence could disrupt the delicate progress the community had made. He left Memphis later that day, returning to the life he had built elsewhere. But his visit left an impression on those who had heard him speak, a reminder that even the deepest scars could carry lessons and that redemption was a journey, not a destination. The New Hope Community Center continued to grow, its mission expanding to meet the needs of a city that had been through so much. Under Anissa's leadership, the center became a cornerstone of the community, a place where people could find support, guidance, and hope. Marcus's work with youth deepened, and his influence extended beyond the city, inspiring others to address the systemic issues that plagued their neighborhoods. Together, Anissa and Marcus had taken the ashes of a broken institution and built something stronger, something real. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they had become part of the story, a story of failure, forgiveness, and the resilience of the human spirit. The New Hope Community Center stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people chose to confront the truth and work together to create something better. And in that, there was a kind of redemption that went beyond words, a redemption that was lived every day in the lives that were touched and the futures that were changed. In July 2015, Loretta Jackson, a 48-year-old woman living in Tampa, Florida, found herself immersed in the familiar rhythm of her daily life. She was married to Edward Jackson, the pastor of a local Baptist church, and together they had raised 3 children who had long since moved out to start their own lives. For nearly 2 decades, 18 years, to be exact, Loretta had stood by Edward's side as he led his congregation with a steady hand. She had taken on her own roles within the church, directing the choir with a gentle but firm touch, organizing charity luncheons that filled the community hall with the clatter of plates and the hum of grateful voices, and offering quiet support to her husband whenever he needed it. Their home sat on a modest plot near the bay, a simple but welcoming place where the salty tang of the Gulf mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias carried on the humid breeze. The summer heat had settled over Tampa like a thick blanket, pressing down on the city with unrelenting force. Loretta often stood on the porch in the early mornings, watching the sun rise over the water, its golden light shimmering across the surface before the day's humidity took hold. Inside, the house stayed cool enough thanks to the whirring ceiling fans and the occasional breeze that slipped through the open windows. She kept the place tidy, the wooden floors polished to a soft shine, the kitchen stocked with jars of homemade preserves she'd put up in the spring. It was a life she had built with care, one that felt steady and predictable, rooted in faith and routine. But over the past few months, something had shifted. Loretta had begun to notice a change in Edward, subtle at first, but growing harder to ignore as the weeks wore on. He had always been a busy man, his days filled with sermons, counseling sessions, and visits to the sick or grieving members of their flock. Yet lately, his absences had stretched longer than usual. He would leave the house with little explanation, returning late with a distracted air about him. When she asked where he'd been, his answers came vague and clipped, brushed off with a wave of his hand or a tired sigh. Then there were the phone calls, short, hushed exchanges that came in the dead of night, rousing her from sleep as Edward slipped out of bed to take them in the hallway. She'd lie there, eyes tracing the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of his voice through the walls, unable to make out the words. Loretta told herself it was nothing more than exhaustion. Edward carried the weight of the church on his shoulders, a burden that had only grown heavier with time. The congregation had swelled in recent years, drawing new faces to the pews, and with them came new demands, more souls to shepherd, more problems to solve. She convinced herself that his distance was a passing phase, a season of strain that would ease once the summer heat broke and the pace of life slowed. Still, a quiet unease took root in her chest, a nagging sensation she couldn't quite shake, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull free. Adding to her unease was a physical discomfort that had crept up on her in recent weeks. It started as a faint ache low in her abdomen, a dull twinge that came and went with no pattern she could discern. At first, she dismissed it as a product of the oppressive weather. July in Tampa was a trial for anyone, with its sticky air and temperatures that climbed into the high 90s by noon. She was no stranger to the toll the heat could take, the way it sapped her energy and left her feeling sluggish. Or perhaps it was her age, she reasoned. At 48, her body wasn't as resilient as it once had been. She ignored the pain as best she could, pushing through her chores and church duties with the same determination that had carried her through 18 years of marriage. She swept the porch, rehearsed hymns with the choir, and smiled through the sweat beading on her forehead, telling herself it would pass. Yet as the days stretched on, the ache lingered, a quiet companion that shadowed her through the sweltering summer. She kept it to herself, not wanting to trouble Edward when he already seemed so preoccupied. In the mornings, she'd stand at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee and watching the gulls wheel over the bay, her hand resting lightly on her stomach as if she could will the discomfort away. The house buzzed with the small sounds of life, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under her feet, but beneath it all, Loretta felt the first stirrings of something unsettled, a premonition she couldn't name. For now, she held fast to the routines that had always anchored her, trusting they would see her through whatever lay ahead. The ache that had shadowed Loretta for weeks grew sharper as July wore on, no longer a fleeting discomfort but a piercing pain that stabbed at her insides with increasing insistence. It struck hardest at night, pulling her from restless sleep with jolts that left her clutching the sheets, her breath shallow in the humid darkness. She lay awake in the small hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily overhead, its blades cutting through the stillness while Edward slept soundly beside her, oblivious to her struggle. The pain had become too persistent to ignore, a nagging force that gnawed at her resolve until she could no longer dismiss it as a quirk of the weather or a sign of creeping age. She decided she had to see a doctor, though the thought of it tightened her chest with a mix of dread and reluctance. She chose not to tell Edward about her plan. He had been consumed lately with preparations for a grand Sunday service, a special event meant to mark the church's anniversary and draw the congregation together in celebration. His days were filled with meetings, his evenings spent hunched over sermon notes at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. Loretta saw the strain in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching, and she didn't want to add to his burdens. She told herself she could handle this quietly, slip away to the clinic and return with answers before he even noticed she'd been gone. So one morning, after he left for the church, she drove herself across town, the steering wheel slick under her palms from the heat and her own nervous sweat. The clinic in Tampa sat low and unassuming, its beige walls baking under the relentless sun. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, filled with the steady hum of air conditioners that battled the Florida humidity and the sharp scent of antiseptic that clung to everything. Loretta sat in the waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor as she tried to steady her breathing. When her name was called, she followed a nurse down a narrow hallway to an examination room, where the doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and wire-rimmed glasses, greeted her with a nod. He asked her questions about the pain, jotting notes on a clipboard as she described its rhythm and intensity, her voice low and hesitant. Then came the examination, a routine procedure that turned anything but routine when the doctor's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something more guarded. He stepped back, his gloved hand still poised, and took a moment before speaking. What he found inside her defied comprehension, a foreign object, a used condom, lodged where it had no business being. Blood tests confirmed an infection, the kind that suggested more than just an isolated incident. The words hit Loretta like a physical blow, draining the color from her face and leaving her ears ringing as if the room had tilted beneath her. She sat frozen on the exam table, the paper crinkling under her trembling hands, her mind a chaotic swirl of disbelief and confusion. The doctor explained it carefully, his tone measured and clinical, but she barely registered the details, something about immediate treatment, follow-up tests, questions she couldn't answer. When he finished, he offered her a moment alone, and she nodded mutely, staring at the wall as he slipped out of the room. The drive home passed in a haze. The streets of Tampa blurred past her windshield, the palm trees and strip malls melting into a smear of green and concrete under the midday glare. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles aching, trying to piece together how this could have happened, how something so unthinkable had invaded her body and her life. By the time she pulled into the driveway, her blouse clung to her back with sweat, and her thoughts were a tangled knot she couldn't unravel. She sat in the car for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, before forcing herself to step out into the oppressive heat and walk into the house. Edward was home when she entered, his presence unexpected. He sat in the living room, flipping through a hymnal, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she crossed the threshold, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of her pallor, the way her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He set the book aside and stood, crossing the room with a purpose that made her stomach twist. He asked her what was wrong, his voice edged with concern, but Loretta brushed it off with a weak wave of her hand. She muttered something about feeling under the weather, the heat getting to her, anything to avoid the truth clawing at her throat. She couldn't bring herself to tell him, not yet, not when she didn't understand it herself, not when the mere thought of saying it aloud threatened to shatter the fragile peace they'd maintained for so long. He pressed her, his insistence gentle but firm, but she turned away, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of needing water, her heart pounding against her ribs. As she stood at the sink, filling a glass with shaking hands, whispers from the church crept into her mind. She'd heard them before, faint murmurs passed between the pews, rumors about Edward and a new parishioner, a young widow named Cheryl who had joined the congregation a few months back. The woman had a quiet beauty and a tragic story that drew sympathy, and lately, people had noticed how often Edward lingered in her company after services, how he'd been seen driving her home on more than one occasion. Loretta had dismissed it as idle gossip, the kind that flourished in small communities with too much time and too little to talk about. But now, standing in the dim light of her kitchen, the rumors took on a darker shade, feeding the doubt that gnawed at her alongside the doctor's impossible revelation. She set the glass down untouched, her fingers curling into fists, and wondered how long she could keep this shadow from breaking into the open. The day had dragged on with a sluggish weight, each hour soaked in the oppressive heat that clung to Tampa like a second skin. By evening, Loretta and Edward found themselves alone in the living room, the house settling into a quiet that felt heavy and expectant. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple, but the air remained thick and stagnant, pressing against the windows with no hint of relief. The ceiling fan whirred above them, its blade slicing through the humidity in a futile attempt to stir the stillness, while a single lamp cast a warm, dim glow across the room. Loretta sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her body tense with the secret she'd carried since morning. Edward sprawled in the armchair across from her, his legs stretched out, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest, his mind still half occupied with the day's demands. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the doctor's words had grown unbearable, a pressure that built inside her chest until it threatened to burst. She took a steadying breath and began to speak, her voice low and halting as she recounted her visit to the clinic. She described the examination, the doctor's discovery of the used condom, the infection that followed, each detail spilling out like shards of glass she couldn't keep contained. Edward listened in silence, his posture stiffening with every word. His hands stopped their restless movement, curling into fists that rested heavily on the arms of the chair. His face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening, his eyes narrowing into slits as he stared at her, unblinking. When she finished, the room fell into a stillness so profound it seemed the air itself held its breath. He rose abruptly, the chair creaking under the sudden shift of his weight. His fists remained clenched at his sides as he towered over her, his shadow stretching across the floor. He accused her of infidelity, his certainty cutting through the space between them like a blade. He didn't ask for explanations or entertain the possibility of misunderstanding. His mind had seized on betrayal as the only truth, and he clung to it with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. Loretta recoiled, stunned by the venom in his reaction. She had expected shock, perhaps anger, but not this immediate, unshakable conviction that she had strayed. Her own confusion and fear surged to the surface, mingling with a sudden, sharp indignation. She pushed herself to her feet, her hands trembling as she faced him, and threw the rumors about Cheryl back at him, her words fueled by the whispers she tried so hard to ignore. The ones about his late-night drives with the widow, the ones the church elders had let slip in hushed tones. The air between them crackled with tension, their voices rising in a jagged crescendo that drowned out the hum of the fan. Old wounds tore open, grievances buried for years clawing their way into the light. Loretta's hurt over Edward's unexplained absences, his evasiveness, his detachment, all of it poured out in a rush, her restraint crumbling under the weight of the day's revelations. Edward's fury fed on her defiance, his own guilt and suspicion twisting into a storm he couldn't control. He took a step closer, his chest heaving, and she matched him by stepping back, their movements a tense dance across the worn rug. The argument spiraled, each accusation building on the last, until it reached a breaking point neither could pull back from. In a flash of rage, Edward lunged forward, his hands shooting out to grab her shoulders. His fingers dug into her flesh, his grip tight and unyielding as he shook her, demanding she name the man he was certain she'd betrayed him with. His strength overwhelmed her, his knuckles whitening as he held her in place, his face contorted with a mix of anger and desperation. Loretta's breath caught, her body jolting under his grasp. She twisted against him, her arms flailing as she fought to break free, her feet sliding on the slick floor. She managed to wrench herself loose, stumbling backward toward the kitchen, her heart pounding in her ears. Her retreat was clumsy, her balance thrown by panic and the uneven footing of the room's threshold. Her heel caught the leg of a chair, its wooden frame scraping against the tiles as it shifted under her weight. She flailed, her arms reaching for something to steady herself, but there was nothing within grasp. Her momentum carried her back, and she crashed into the edge of the kitchen table with a force that reverberated through her frame. The impact drove the air from her lungs, a dull thud echoing in the small space as her head snapped back against the table's sharp corner. Pain exploded behind her eyes, a blinding flash that faded into darkness as she crumpled to the floor. Her body landed in a heap, one arm twisted beneath her, her leg splayed at an awkward angle. A thin trickle of blood seeped from where her head had struck, pooling slowly on the linoleum, its edges spreading like tendrils in the dim light. Edward stood rooted to the spot, his hands still outstretched, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The fury that had driven him drained away in an instant, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. He stared down at her motionless form, her chest still, her eyes half open but unseeing. The room seemed to close in around him, the hum of the fan a distant drone beneath the roar of his own pulse. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped, his hands falling limp at his sides. The weight of what he'd done settled over him, a suffocating truth he couldn't unmake. Loretta lay there, silent and still, and Edward understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than any anger, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The blood spread across the kitchen linoleum in a slow, deliberate crawl, its dark edges blending with the faint brown stains of coffee Loretta had spilled that morning and never quite cleaned up. Edward stood over her, his feet planted on the tiles, his body rigid with a terror that rooted him in place. The sight of her lifeless form, her chest still, her eyes glassy and fixed on nothing, bore into him, each detail sharpening the reality he couldn't escape. Her head rested at an odd angle against the table's edge, a thin stream of crimson trickling from the point of impact, matting her hair and pooling beneath her. His hands trembled at his sides, the adrenaline that had fueled his rage now replaced by a cold, hollow panic that clawed at his insides. He understood she was gone, the finality of it sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. His mind raced, a chaotic flood of images flashing before him, the church pews filled with faces he'd preached to for years, his children's accusing stares, a courtroom gavel slamming down, the shame of a pastor undone by his own hand. The life he'd built, the reputation he'd guarded so fiercely, teetered on the edge of ruin. Calling the police was the logical step, the right one, but the thought choked him. They'd see through him in an instant, his shaking hands, his unsteady breath, the scene that screamed of something more than an accident. Fear overpowered reason, and instead of reaching for the phone to confess, he chose a different path. He decided to cover it up, to bend the truth into something he could survive. He moved quickly, his actions driven by instinct rather than a clear plan. He grabbed a dish rag from the sink, its faded checkered pattern damp from earlier use, and dropped to his knees beside her. He wiped at the blood on the floor, smearing it at first before scrubbing harder, the rag growing heavy and stained as it soaked up the evidence. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the stale air of the kitchen. He paused to steady himself, his eyes darting to Loretta's body, then forced himself to keep going. When the floor was as clean as he could manage, he turned his attention to her position. She looked too deliberate, too posed in her collapse, so he shifted her carefully. He slid her arm out from under her torso, adjusted her legs to mimic a natural fall, and tilted her head slightly as if she'd simply slipped and struck the table on her way down. The scene still felt incomplete, too sterile for a convincing accident. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on a glass sitting on the counter, half full of water from earlier. He snatched it up, his grip tight, and hurled it to the floor near her feet. The shatter was loud, jarring in the quiet house, and shards skittered across the tiles, glinting in the faint light from the living room lamp. It looked plausible now, a stumble, a spilled drink, a tragic misstep. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants, his pulse hammering in his ears as he surveyed his work. The kitchen bore the marks of a hurried lie, but he convinced himself it might hold, at least long enough to buy him time. He reached for the phone on the wall, its cord dangling in a loose coil, and dialed 911. As the line rang, he willed his voice to crack, his breathing to hitch, summoning the panic he needed to sell the story. When the operator answered, he stumbled through an explanation. His wife had fallen, she wasn't moving, he didn't know what happened, his words tumbling out in a rush of feigned desperation. He paced the small space as he spoke, his eyes flicking to Loretta's body, the glass, the rag he'd shoved under the sink. The operator's calm instructions barely registered. He muttered agreements, promises to stay on the line, but his focus was elsewhere, on the fragile illusion he'd crafted. The wail of sirens cut through the night minutes later, growing louder as red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the walls in erratic streaks. 2 paramedics burst through the front door, their boots heavy on the hardwood, their faces set with the urgency of their trade. Edward stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen with a trembling hand, his throat tight as he watched them kneel beside Loretta. They checked her pulse, shone a light into her unblinking eyes, their movements swift and practiced. One of them pressed fingers to her wrist, then her neck, his brow furrowing as he found no sign of life. The other tilted her head gently, examining the wound, and paused. He noticed the bruises blooming on her arms, dark, finger-shaped marks that hadn't been there that morning, and the unnatural twist of her neck, too severe for a simple fall. The paramedics exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. One reached for his radio, his voice low as he called it in, requesting police assistance. Edward hovered near the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets to hide their shaking, his stomach churning as the weight of their scrutiny settled over him. The medics continued their assessment, their hands careful but probing, and with each passing second, Edward felt the threads of his deception unraveling. The bruises, the angle of her body, the faint smear of blood he'd missed on the table's edge, they were clues he couldn't erase, signs that pointed to a truth he couldn't outrun. The sirens had faded, but a new sound rose in their place, the distant rumble of police cars closing in, tightening the net around him with every turn of their wheels. The police arrived within an hour, their cruiser pulling up to the curb with a quiet crunch of gravel under the tires. Two detectives from the Tampa Police Department stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the flashing lights that still pulsed from the paramedics' ambulance. They were seasoned investigators, their eyes sharp and their movements deliberate, honed by years of sifting through the wreckage of human mistakes. The night air hung heavy with moisture, the kind of sticky warmth that Florida summers never relinquished, even after dark. As they crossed the threshold into the house, their shirts darkened with sweat, clinging to their backs as they took in the scene. They moved into the kitchen, where Loretta's body still lay, now cordoned off by the paramedics who lingered nearby, their faces grim. The detectives began their work methodically, their gazes sweeping over the room with practiced precision. One crouched near the body, his flashlight tracing the contours of Loretta's form, noting the awkward angle of her head and the bruises that marred her arms. The other circled the space, his steps slow and measured, his attention drawn to the counter, the sink, the trash bin tucked against the wall. He nudged the bin's lid open with a gloved hand and froze. Inside, buried beneath a crumpled paper towel, sat the blood-soaked rag Edward had used to wipe the floor. The faint metallic scent rose to meet him, unmistakable even in the humid air. He pulled it free, holding it up to the light, the stained fabric a silent accusation that contradicted the story Edward had spun. Edward stood in the living room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his breath shallow as he watched the detectives at work. Their presence unnerved him, their silence more damning than any question. When they approached him, their expressions unreadable, he stuck to his account. Loretta had tripped, fallen, hit her head, a tragic accident he couldn't prevent. But the detectives weren't convinced. The rag, the body's position, the glass shards that seemed too conveniently scattered, they didn't align with a simple mishap. They escorted him to their car, the cuffs clicking around his wrists with a cold finality, and drove him to the station. In the interrogation room, a stark box of concrete and flickering fluorescent lights, Edward sat across from them, his hands clasped on the table, his posture rigid with forced confidence. He repeated his tale, his voice steady at first, each word carefully placed to shield him from the truth. The autopsy came the next morning, conducted in a sterile room at the county morgue while the sun climbed over Tampa's skyline. The medical examiner worked with clinical efficiency, his tools glinting under the harsh lights as he examined Loretta's remains. The findings unraveled Edward's fragile narrative in an instant. She hadn't died from the blow to her head, as he'd claimed. The table's edge had left a mark, yes, but the real cause lay deeper, a fracture in her cervical vertebrae, snapped under intense pressure, not a fall. Bruises encircled her neck, faint but distinct, their pattern suggesting hands that had gripped and held, cutting off her air until her body gave out. The report landed on the detectives' desks by noon, its pages a stark map of violence that no accident could explain. Back at the station, the detectives confronted Edward with the evidence. They laid the autopsy photos before him, Loretta's pale face, the purpled marks on her throat, the blood matted in her hair, each image a hammer blow to his defenses. They pressed him, their questions methodical, peeling back the layers of his story with relentless calm. Edward's resolve wavered, his fingers twitching against the table, his eyes darting to the pictures he couldn't bear to face. The weight of the truth bore down on him, crushing the lies he'd clung to. He broke, his shoulders slumping, his breath escaping in a shuddering rush. He admitted to the argument, the surge of anger, the moment he'd pushed her, harder than he'd meant, he insisted, watching her fall. He swore he hadn't intended to kill her, that it was a mistake born of rage, but the words rang hollow against the bruises that told a different story. Word spread quickly through the church, a ripple of shock that swelled into chaos by evening. The congregation gathered in whispered clusters, their faith shaken as the news filtered out. Pastor Edward, their shepherd, had taken his wife's life. The sanctuary, once a place of solace, buzzed with disbelief and grief, its stained glass windows casting muted colors over pews that felt emptier now. The elders met in hushed urgency, their voices low as they grappled with the betrayal of a man they'd trusted. Loretta's children, scattered across the state, received the calls one by one, first the police, then friends, then the fractured accounts of parishioners. They turned away from their father, Their silence a wall he couldn't breach, their refusal to speak to him a judgment sharper than any court's. Edward sat alone in a holding cell, the clang of the door echoing in his ears, the reality of his unraveling world closing in like the humid night outside. By September 2015, Edward Jackson stood before the judge in the Hillsborough County Courthouse in Tampa, a cavernous room with high ceilings and polished wooden benches that creaked under the weight of its occupants. The trial had drawn a crowd that spilled into the aisles, church members who once sat under his sermons, reporters scribbling notes for the evening papers, and locals who'd come for the spectacle of a fallen pastor. The air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and the faint hum of a struggling air conditioner, unable to fully combat the lingering heat of late summer. Edward's once imposing frame, draped for years in the flowing robes of his calling, was now swallowed by the loose fit of an orange jumpsuit, its bright fabric a stark contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom. His hands, cuffed in front of him, rested limply as he faced the bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. The proceedings unfolded over days, a slow unraveling of evidence and testimony that left little room for doubt. The prosecution laid out the autopsy findings, the detectives recounted their discoveries, and the paramedics described the scene they'd walked into that night. Edward's defense offered a plea of passion, a momentary lapse, but the bruises on Loretta's neck and the fracture in her spine painted a picture too deliberate to dismiss. When the judge delivered the verdict, 20 years in prison for manslaughter with aggravating circumstances, his gavel struck with a finality that echoed through the room. Edward didn't flinch, his face a mask of resignation, though his shoulders sagged as the bailiff led him away, the chains clinking softly with each step. The church felt the loss like a wound torn open. Without Edward, the pulpit stood empty, its authority diminished by the stain of his actions. The choir, once Loretta's pride, fell silent, its members too shaken to lift their voices in song. Sunday services dwindled, the congregation fracturing as some drifted to other churches and others simply stayed home, unable to reconcile their faith with the man they'd followed. The elders scrambled to appoint an interim leader, but the momentum of 18 years slipped through their fingers, leaving the sanctuary a hollow shell of its former self. The house by the bay, with its view of the water and its magnolia-scented porch, went up for sale within weeks. Strangers walked its floors, peering into closets and testing faucets, while the memories of Loretta's preserves and Edward's late-night sermon prep faded into the walls. Loretta's children made their own exodus from Florida, each packing up their lives with a quiet determination to distance themselves from the wreckage. The eldest drove north to Georgia, the middle child west to Texas, and the youngest south to Miami, scattering like seeds caught in a storm. They didn't visit Edward, didn't call, didn't write. Their silence was a severance he felt more keenly than the bars of his cell, a rejection that carved out a hollow space in his chest. The family name, once spoken with respect in Tampa's tight-knit circles, became a whisper of scandal, a burden they refused to carry. They left behind the humid shores of the Gulf, the church bulletins still listing their parents' names, and the town that wouldn't let the story die. Edward found himself in a cell at the state prison, a narrow rectangle of concrete and steel where the air smelled of sweat and bleach. He sat on the thin mattress, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the gray wall as the days blurred into one another. His mind turned over the pieces of his downfall, those rumors about Cheryl that had haunted his marriage, the jealousy that had festered in his gut, the flash of rage that had undone everything. He replayed the nights he'd spent with the widow, brief moments of weakness he'd justified as harmless, and wondered if they'd somehow led to the condom that shattered his world. But Loretta had taken that answer with her, burying it in the silence of her grave, leaving him with a question that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. He'd never know the truth, and that uncertainty became a companion as constant as the clang of the cell block doors. Tampa settled back into its rhythms, the heat of summer giving way to the milder days of fall, though the humidity lingered like a memory. The story of the pastor who killed his wife didn't fade easily. It lingered on porches and in diners, recounted over iced tea and cigarettes as the sun dipped low over the bay. Locals leaned close, their voices hushed, piecing together the tale, the argument, the fall, the trial, each telling adding a layer of myth to the facts. Edward's name became a cautionary thread woven into the town's fabric, a reminder of how quickly grace could turn to ruin. The house sold to a young couple from out of state, the church found a new pastor, and life moved on, but the echo of that sweltering July night hung in the air, a ghost that Tampa couldn't quite shake. On the evening of September 14, 2010, the life of Pastor Henry Williams changed forever. His 19-year-old daughter, Ashley, a promising student at the University of Memphis and a devoted member of the New Hope Church, failed to return home as expected. Henry and his wife, Linda, initially assumed she had lost track of time, perhaps caught up in studying or a church activity. However, as the night stretched on and their calls went unanswered, their worry deepened into a gnawing fear. By morning, their concern had escalated into desperation. Linda contacted Ashley's friends, none of whom had seen her since the previous afternoon. Henry reached out to the campus security office, who reported no signs of Ashley on university grounds. With rising anxiety, they turned to the Memphis Police Department, filing a missing persons report. Officers launched an immediate search, combing through Ashley's regular routes and reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses and campus facilities. It was on the afternoon of September 15 that the worst possible news reached the Williams family. Ashley's lifeless body was discovered in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The scene was grim, with signs of prolonged suffering and violence. Investigators found conclusive evidence indicating she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned detectives. DNA evidence and security camera footage from nearby streets provided crucial leads that pointed directly to three suspects: Justin Carter, Mark Henderson, and Kevin Lee, college students from affluent Memphis families. The arrests came swiftly, bringing a temporary sense of relief to the Williams family and the community. However, the relief soon turned into frustration and despair as the legal proceedings unfolded. The evidence against the perpetrators was overwhelming. Ashley's DNA was found on their clothing, and surveillance footage placed them near the warehouse at the time of the crime. Witness testimonies further corroborated their involvement. Yet, the courtroom became a battleground where the defense leveraged the defendants' privileged backgrounds. The legal team, funded by the suspects' wealthy parents, painted them as misguided young men with bright futures who had made a terrible mistake. Despite the undeniable nature of their crimes, the court system showed leniency. The judge, under pressure from influential figures and presented with a narrative of rehabilitation potential, sentenced each of the young men to a mere 12 years in prison. Good behavior could see them walk free in as little as 8 years. The verdict sent shockwaves through the Williams family, the church congregation, and the wider Memphis community. It felt like a mockery of justice, a slap in the face to those who believed in moral accountability. For Henry Williams, the sentencing was an unbearable betrayal. He had always believed in the power of faith and the integrity of the justice system. But in that moment, he realized that in a world dictated by money and influence, true justice was a fleeting illusion. Linda, shattered by grief, withdrew from the world, spending her days in silence, clutching Ashley's photographs. Meanwhile, Henry found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions: rage, despair, and a growing resolve. In the months that followed, he prayed relentlessly, seeking divine answers to his torment. But as he watched the perpetrators' families continue their lives unaffected, enjoying their wealth and power, a dark realization took hold within him. The courts had failed his daughter. The system had failed his family. If justice would not come through lawful means, he would have to seek it himself. Henry's once unwavering faith in the principles of forgiveness began to waver. The sermons he delivered to his congregation felt hollow. His outward demeanor remained composed, offering comfort and strength to those who sought it, but beneath the surface, a storm raged. He meticulously followed every development in the prison system, tracking the progress of Justin, Mark, and Kevin's sentences. Their release dates were marked in his mind with precision. Day by day, his grief hardened into something sharper, something with purpose. Henry's thoughts turned toward justice of a different kind, a justice that could not be swayed by wealth or influence. He spent nights alone in his study, poring over law books, criminal case studies, and forensic techniques. The man who once preached forgiveness and redemption now found himself contemplating vengeance. The tragedy that had befallen his family had changed him in ways he could no longer ignore. What once felt unthinkable now seemed inevitable. Pastor Henry began preparing for revenge immediately after the sentencing. Outwardly, nothing about him changed. He continued to deliver sermons about love, forgiveness, and redemption. To his congregation, he remained the same compassionate spiritual leader, offering solace and guidance to those in need. However, beneath this carefully maintained facade, darkness took root and grew. Each smile he offered, each prayer he led, masked the seething anger and relentless determination simmering within him. Between 2011 and 2015, Henry immersed himself in the study of forensic science, toxicology, and ballistics. He spent countless late nights poring over books, online journals, and crime documentaries, absorbing knowledge about investigative loopholes and forensic blind spots. He meticulously analyzed case studies of unsolved crimes, learning how perpetrators evaded justice and how law enforcement's limitations could be exploited. Every discovery fueled his obsession, sharpening his focus and solidifying his resolve. His pursuit of knowledge was methodical and relentless. He sought out individuals who had first-hand experience with the justice system, former inmates, disgraced law enforcement officers, and even private investigators. Posing as a prison outreach advocate, Henry earned the trust of these individuals, carefully extracting insights into law enforcement protocols, interrogation techniques, and the vulnerabilities of the prison system. In hushed conversations over coffee and late-night phone calls, he gathered a trove of information about how to avoid detection, destroy evidence, and create airtight alibis. Under the guise of mission work, Henry began regular visits to the state correctional facility where his daughter's killers were incarcerated. He preached to the inmates about salvation and second chances, gaining the favor of prison officials and chaplains. But his true purpose was far more sinister. Observing the routines and habits of the three men who had destroyed his life, Henry took note of their daily activities, behavioral patterns, and interactions with other prisoners. He watched how they responded to authority, their alliances within the prison walls, and their weaknesses. He maintained a journal where he recorded every detail, what time they exercised, which guards were friendly with them, and how often they received visitors. By 2016, Henry decided he needed to take his preparation to another level. He enrolled in a self-defense and security training program under the pretense of wanting to better protect his church and community. Through this, he gained proficiency in handling firearms, close-quarters combat, and evasive driving techniques. He attended firearms training courses, where he learned to fire with precision and studied the mechanics of various weapons. Each lesson was not just about self-defense, it was about planning for the future. Henry purchased and registered a firearm legally, keeping it hidden under layers of deception, ensuring that no one suspected his true intentions. His transformation extended beyond physical skills. Henry carefully monitored his financial transactions, ensuring that any purchases related to his plan were untraceable. He began using cash for every suspicious expense, avoided using his home computer for research, and utilized public libraries and internet cafes to cover his digital trail. He knew that patience was key, revenge could not be rushed. As the years passed, Henry perfected the art of concealment. He developed a routine that left no room for suspicion, balancing his pastoral duties with his secret preparations. He continued to lead community events, organize charity drives, and counsel troubled youth, all while nurturing the storm that raged within him. He kept his emotions buried beneath layers of composed faith, ensuring that no one, not even his closest friends, would suspect the darkness lurking beneath his surface. His wife, Linda, buried herself in grief, withdrawing from the outside world. Henry let her mourn in silence, never revealing the thoughts that consumed him. He played the role of the grieving father, yet behind closed doors, he meticulously assembled the pieces of his plan, refining each element with surgical precision. He researched everything from poisons that left no trace in autopsies to methods of staging accidents that would appear entirely natural. He understood that the key to a successful plan was time and patience. He knew that justice would not come quickly. He had to wait for the day when those men would step out of their prison cells, free and unburdened, believing that they had escaped their sins. Henry knew they would walk out with smiles on their faces, thinking their wealthy families had shielded them from real consequences. That thought alone kept him going through the sleepless nights and the gnawing pain of loss. Every action he took was calculated, every step measured. Henry envisioned the moment of retribution not with reckless rage, but with cold, methodical precision. He was not a man driven by impulse, he was a man with a plan, a man who had been forced to take justice into his own hands. He rehearsed every possibility in his mind, leaving no detail unchecked, no variable unaccounted for. The day of their release loomed closer, and with it, the anticipation of Henry's final act of justice. They believed they had moved on, but Henry knew better. He would wait, just as he had waited all these years, biding his time until the moment was right. Revenge, he knew, was not something to be rushed. It was something to be perfected. In 2022, after serving their sentences, Justin, Mark, and Kevin walked out of prison, their freedom restored. They returned to Memphis, stepping back into a world that seemed to have moved on without them. Their wealthy families had paved the way for their reintegration, ensuring that their criminal pasts were nothing more than a footnote in their otherwise privileged lives. With their records quietly expunged from the public eye and their reputations carefully reconstructed, they slipped back into society with ease. Their families arranged for them to have comfortable jobs and well-established businesses, generous trust funds, and luxurious homes in upscale neighborhoods. Any whispers of their involvement in Ashley's death were buried under layers of influence and wealth. Within months, they were attending social events, rubbing shoulders with Memphis's elite, and presenting themselves as reformed young men ready to contribute to society. The same people who once mourned Ashley's loss now greeted them with polite smiles and firm handshakes, as if her murder had been a distant tragedy, long forgotten. Henry watched from a distance as they celebrated their new beginnings. He saw them enjoying their freedom, laughing, dining in high-end restaurants, and hosting parties in their extravagant homes. Their lives were filled with opportunities, while his remained shattered and hollow. With every sighting, his anger deepened, and the ache of injustice burned hotter within him. It became clear that their remorse had been nothing more than a performance, carefully crafted for the courtroom. They had moved on, unburdened by guilt or consequence. Henry knew it was time to act. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and he would not let it slip away. His first step was securing a base of operations, an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. The dilapidated building blended perfectly with its surroundings, overlooked and ignored by the world around it. He spent weeks renovating it in secret, soundproofing the walls, installing locks, and setting up hidden compartments to store his carefully curated arsenal of tools and supplies. Every corner of the house was designed with precision, ensuring that no sound would escape and no trace of his actions would ever be discovered. To get closer to his targets, Henry assumed a new identity. He meticulously crafted a persona of a successful businessman from Atlanta, recently relocated to Memphis to expand his investments in charitable initiatives. Through carefully planned interactions and strategically attended events, he began to weave his way into their social circles. He donated to community projects, sponsored youth programs, and engaged with influential figures in the city. His polished demeanor, wealth, and supposed interest in philanthropy made him an attractive figure in elite gatherings, where Justin, Mark, and Kevin frequented. Gradually, Henry became a familiar face at charity events and fundraisers, casually crossing paths with the three men who had taken everything from him. He watched their habits, studied their routines, and listened to their conversations with practiced patience. He observed how they interacted with their friends, their colleagues, and the women in their lives. With each encounter, he reinforced his false persona, presenting himself as a kind-hearted and approachable man with no connection to their past. As his presence in their world solidified, Henry strategically positioned himself as a potential business partner and advisor, offering insights into community development projects and financial investments. He carefully planted the seeds of trust, ensuring that his targets saw him as an asset rather than a threat. With every handshake and every exchange of pleasantries, he felt himself drawing closer to his ultimate goal. His efforts went unnoticed by those around him. To the outside world, he was just another generous benefactor, eager to make a difference. His charm and calculated charisma allowed him to slip into their lives seamlessly, undetected and unsuspected. Meanwhile, he continued his preparations behind the scenes, fine-tuning every aspect of his plan with relentless precision. Henry understood the importance of patience. He knew he had to move slowly, to let his targets become comfortable in his presence. They needed to believe they were safe, that their past crimes were buried forever. Only then, when they were at their most vulnerable, would he strike. Justin Carter was the first target. Henry had spent weeks observing his routines, tracking his movements with unwavering patience. Each morning, Justin followed the same pattern, waking early, driving his black SUV to a local gym, and working out alone before heading to his office. The gym was located in a quiet commercial area, with minimal foot traffic during the early hours. Henry carefully studied the surroundings, identifying potential blind spots and escape routes. He mapped out the nearby streets, ensuring he could execute his plan without drawing attention. The abandoned parking lot adjacent to the gym became his chosen site. It was rarely used, overgrown with weeds, and partially hidden from the main road. Surveillance cameras in the area were outdated and barely functional, making it the perfect location for an ambush. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Henry rehearsed the timing, ensuring every detail was precise. He knew exactly when Justin would exit the gym, the precise moment to strike, and how much time he would have before anyone noticed his absence. On the morning of the planned execution, Henry arrived at the parking lot before dawn. Dressed in dark, inconspicuous clothing, he parked his unmarked van in a shadowy corner and waited. He watched as Justin finished his workout and walked out, casually checking his phone and heading toward his car. With calculated precision, Henry moved swiftly, striking Justin with a high-voltage stun gun before he could react. The electric jolt sent him collapsing onto the pavement, his body convulsing before going limp. Without hesitation, Henry lifted him into the van, ensuring the gym's security cameras would only capture fleeting, indistinct movements. Once inside the van, Henry secured Justin with heavy-duty restraints, binding his wrists and ankles to prevent any possibility of escape. The drive to the secluded house was uneventful. Henry had carefully chosen routes with minimal traffic, avoiding major intersections and areas with active surveillance. He maintained a calm demeanor, his mind focused on the task ahead. Upon arrival at the abandoned house, Henry dragged Justin inside and secured him to a chair in the center of the dimly lit room. The space was carefully arranged, walls lined with soundproofing material, the floor covered with a thick plastic sheet, and a single lamp casting harsh light over the scene. Photographs of Ashley were strategically placed around the room, images of her smiling, full of life, and then the haunting images from the crime scene reports. Henry wanted Justin to see the face of the girl whose life he had destroyed. As Justin slowly regained consciousness, confusion and fear contorted his features. Henry stood silently, watching him struggle against the restraints, his breathing ragged and panicked. There was no room for mercy in Henry's heart. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, and now, standing face to face with the man who had stolen his daughter's future, his resolve was absolute. Without hesitation, Henry prepared the lethal injection. Over the years, he had studied various toxins, searching for one that would mimic a natural heart attack. The experimental compound he had procured induced cardiac arrest within minutes, leaving no traceable evidence during a routine autopsy. As the needle punctured Justin's vein, Henry observed the fear in his eyes, the realization dawning too late. Within minutes, Justin's body went still, his chest rising and falling one last time before life slipped away. Henry meticulously wiped down the scene, removing any trace of his presence. He transported Justin's lifeless body back to his apartment, carefully positioning him on his bed, making it appear as if he had simply passed away in his sleep. Prescription pill bottles were placed strategically on the nightstand, and the room was left undisturbed to suggest natural causes. When Justin's body was discovered later that day, the authorities found no signs of foul play. The medical examiner's report cited sudden cardiac arrest, likely exacerbated by years of steroid use and an undiagnosed heart condition. His wealthy family, eager to avoid scandal, moved swiftly to suppress any further investigation. The police, accustomed to covering up the mistakes of the elite, closed the case without question. Henry watched the news coverage from a distance, his expression devoid of satisfaction or remorse. The first step in his plan had been executed flawlessly. There were no suspicions, no loose ends. He knew that the real justice, the justice denied to Ashley, had finally begun. Mark Henderson was the next target. Unlike Justin, Mark had chosen a quieter life after his release, opting to work at his father's construction company. Henry observed him from a distance, carefully monitoring his routines and daily habits. Mark's work schedule was predictable, with long hours spent managing on-site operations at various construction projects across Memphis. He arrived early in the mornings and often stayed late into the evenings, overseeing tasks and ensuring that deadlines were met. Henry knew that construction sites were inherently dangerous places, and with the right planning, Mark's death could be made to look like a tragic accident. Henry spent weeks studying the site where Mark was assigned. He visited under the guise of a contractor looking for employment, carefully noting the layout, the equipment, and the structural weaknesses. He paid close attention to the scaffolding that Mark frequently used, identifying its vulnerabilities and planning the perfect opportunity to strike. Each observation reinforced his understanding of the environment and provided him with the precise knowledge needed to manipulate it to his advantage. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, Henry infiltrated the construction site. The security measures were lax, with a single night guard who rarely left his post at the front entrance. Avoiding detection, Henry made his way to the scaffolding structure where Mark typically worked. He loosened critical bolts and weakened key support joints, ensuring that the structure would hold under light pressure but would inevitably fail under significant weight. Every move was calculated, every detail meticulously planned to guarantee that when the time came, it would appear as nothing more than a tragic workplace accident. Days passed before the opportunity presented itself. On a particularly busy afternoon, Mark climbed the scaffolding to oversee a delivery of materials. The weakened structure gave way under his weight, collapsing in an instant and sending him plummeting to the ground below. The fall was catastrophic, and emergency responders pronounced him dead at the scene. His colleagues were in shock, attributing the accident to faulty equipment and the inherent dangers of construction work. The investigation into the incident was brief. Inspectors cited a failure in the scaffolding's structural integrity, blaming improper maintenance and wear over time. The company, eager to avoid liability, quickly settled with Mark's family and moved forward without delving deeper into the cause. The site's security cameras, which could have captured any suspicious activity, had been conveniently offline due to a reported technical issue, an issue carefully orchestrated by Henry days before the incident. With Mark gone, only Kevin Lee remained. Unlike the others, Kevin was more cautious. Following his release, he relocated to a different city, putting distance between himself and his past. He rarely appeared in public and kept a low profile, as though expecting retribution for his crimes. Henry, however, was relentless. He tracked Kevin's movements, using his network of contacts and surveillance skills to map out his new life. Through persistent effort, he discovered that Kevin had developed a habit of frequenting upscale nightclubs, indulging in excessive drinking and reckless behavior. The nightlife provided an ideal opportunity, crowded, chaotic, and full of distractions. Henry traveled to Kevin's new city, blending seamlessly into the urban landscape. He observed Kevin's routine, noting how he arrived late at night, drank heavily, and left alone in the early morning hours. It was during these moments of vulnerability that Henry planned to strike. One night, after watching Kevin down several drinks at an exclusive lounge, Henry approached the bar under the guise of an ordinary patron. With practiced ease, he slipped a powerful mixture of narcotics into Kevin's drink, an expertly calculated blend designed to mimic a lethal overdose without raising suspicion. Kevin, unaware of the danger, consumed the drink and continued his night as usual. As the effects took hold, he became increasingly disoriented, stumbling as he attempted to leave the club. Henry discreetly followed him outside, watching as Kevin struggled to unlock his car. Seizing the moment, Henry assisted him, feigning concern, and ensured Kevin was safely seated inside. He then subtly positioned him in a way that suggested he had passed out from intoxication before leaving the scene unnoticed. Hours later, Kevin's lifeless body was discovered slumped behind the wheel of his car, parked on a quiet side street. The initial assessment pointed to an overdose, a tragic but unsurprising end for a man with a known history of substance abuse. The toxicology report confirmed a fatal combination of alcohol and narcotics, with no indication of foul play. The authorities quickly ruled it as another unfortunate case of self-destructive behavior, closing the case without further investigation. Henry watched the news coverage of Kevin's death with the same cold detachment he had maintained throughout his pursuit. Each step had been executed with precision, leaving no trace, no suspicion, and no loose ends. The final piece of his plan had fallen into place, and for the first time in years, he felt a semblance of peace. Justice, in his eyes, had been served. Detective Alex Johnson had been working in the Memphis Homicide Division for over 2 decades, and experience had taught him to recognize patterns that others overlooked. When the deaths of Justin Carter, Mark Henderson, and Kevin Lee were reported within months of each other, they initially seemed like isolated incidents: an unfortunate overdose, a tragic construction accident, and an unexpected heart attack. But something about the circumstances nagged at him. The timing, the backgrounds of the victims, and the eerie sense that these deaths were not mere coincidences pushed him to dig deeper. Reviewing the case files late one evening, Johnson found the connection he had been searching for. Each of the deceased men had been convicted years earlier in the same high-profile case, the assault and murder of Ashley Williams. Though the case had faded from public memory, Johnson vividly recalled the outrage that followed their lenient sentences. He pulled the original court records, cross-referencing them with recent surveillance footage from their funerals. A single figure stood out in every frame, lingering in the background: Pastor Henry Williams. Intrigued, Johnson began piecing together the puzzle. He obtained financial records and travel logs for Henry, finding several irregularities. The pastor had quietly liquidated assets over the years, making small but consistent withdrawals that didn't match his modest lifestyle. Hotel bookings, rental cars, and surveillance equipment purchases raised further suspicions. Johnson compared these records with the victims' movements and found unsettling overlaps. Henry had been in the same cities at the same times as each of the 3 men before their deaths. As Johnson's investigation deepened, the evidence against Henry mounted. Traffic camera footage placed his vehicle near the scene of Mark Henderson's accident just days before it occurred. Purchases of toxic chemicals matched the substances found in Justin Carter's system. Witnesses at Kevin Lee's last known nightclub visit described seeing a man matching Henry's description watching from a distance. Johnson knew he was closing in, but he needed more concrete proof to bring him in. Henry, sensing the inevitable, took matters into his own hands. Before the police could formally arrest him, he walked into the precinct on a cold February morning, carrying a leather-bound journal. Without hesitation, he placed it on Johnson's desk and sat down, his expression calm and resolute. The journal contained meticulous details of his actions, dates, methods, even his thoughts in the years leading up to his carefully orchestrated revenge. Page after page outlined his calculated pursuit of justice, from his years of planning to the execution of each step. During questioning, Henry remained composed. He neither denied nor justified his actions. Instead, he simply recounted them with unwavering conviction. He refused legal representation, declining to mount any defense. In the courtroom, he stood before the judge, prosecutors, and spectators with a quiet dignity. When given the opportunity to speak, he uttered only one sentence: he had done what the justice system had failed to do. He had avenged his daughter. On March 1, 2024, the court found Henry Williams guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the judge delivered the verdict, but outside, public opinion was deeply divided. Some viewed Henry as a man consumed by grief, driven to madness by the failure of the system. Others saw him as a hero, a grieving father who had taken justice into his own hands when the courts had let him down. In the days following the trial, Henry's story spread across media outlets and social circles. His face appeared on news segments, talk shows, and social media platforms. Some condemned his actions as vigilante justice, while others sympathized with the depth of his pain and the righteousness of his cause. The tragedy of his daughter's murder resurfaced, reigniting discussions about the flaws within the judicial system and the privilege that had shielded her killers for so long. Within his church community, Henry became a martyr of sorts. Many of his former congregants believed that he had fulfilled God's will in the only way he knew how. They whispered his name in reverence, sharing his story in hushed voices as a lesson about justice and the limits of human patience. The church where he had once preached love and forgiveness now held his name in bittersweet memory, a symbol of the cost of seeking justice when the world refused to deliver it. Henry himself accepted his fate without regret. In the solitude of his prison cell, he found solace in the belief that he had honored his daughter's memory. He spent his days in quiet reflection, no longer a pastor, no longer a father, just a man who had carried out what he saw as divine justice. Though he had lost his freedom, he had reclaimed something far more valuable in his eyes, his daughter's dignity, her worth, and the justice she had been denied. In the end, Henry Williams had paid the ultimate price for his vengeance. His story became a cautionary tale, a legend that blurred the lines between justice and revenge. And though he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, he carried within him a quiet certainty: he had done what needed to be done.